Good morning, church. Good morning. I cannot wait till I'm not fumbling with cameras and music. And, Lord, please help us get back to normal. This morning, we're going to talk about something. You're probably wondering why Tammy gave you all a fork. But we'll get to that fork. But in my studies, I was going through a lot of things, and I came across a study about Proverbs, and it was titled The Path. And our life is like a path in many ways. So over the next few weeks, we're going to be studying or talking about the path, and we're going to be talking about the book of Proverbs. I'll ask you, have you ever been walking and come to an opening in the trees and you find the path? And our gut instinct is we want to explore that path. We want to go down the path. And a path is what actually gets us from one point to another. But oftentimes, when you're walking down a path, you might come to a fork in the road. And we'll get back to that fork in a few minutes. But what is it that determines our destination? How do we get from here to where we're going? And over the next couple of weeks, we're going to spend some time talking about that. We're going to gain a better understanding of our direction. We're going to decide for sure on how we can get to where we all ultimately want to be. But before we begin any trip, we need to spend a little time learning about where we're headed, as well as how we're going to get there. We need some wisdom. Where do we look for wisdom? The book of Proverbs. That is why this path is going to take us through some of the greatest wisdom ever recorded. This journey that we're going to take together is going to take us through some of the chapters in the book of Proverbs. If you open your Bible to Proverbs 1:1, we're going to read the introduction to Proverbs. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for gaining wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for receiving instruction in prudent behavior, doing what is right and just and fair, for giving prudence to those who are simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Let the wise listen and add their learning, and let the discerning get guidance. For understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings and riddles of the wise. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. We're given this introduction to the book of Proverbs, and the reason we're given it is so that we know for sure why it was written down. It was written down for us. It was written down for all future generations. The book of Proverbs is what is described by Bible scholars as wisdom literature. Some describe having intelligence as you know things. If I have intelligence, I know things. But wisdom is something different. Wisdom is being able to take what you know and applying it to your circumstances. The book of Proverbs was primarily written by King Solomon, perhaps the wisest man who ever lived. In 1 Kings 4:29, we're told, God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight, and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the people of the East, greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone else, including Ethan the Ezrahite, wiser than Heman, Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahal, and his fame spread to all the surrounding nations. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He spoke about plant life, from the cedars of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of walls. He also spoke about animals and birds, reptiles and fish. From all the nations, people came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who had heard of his wisdom. If Solomon were alive today, Solomon would have a master's degree in literature. He'd have a recording contract for all of his songs. And he'd probably have PhDs in philosophy, zoology, ornithology, herpetology, and any of the other ologies that we can think of. But to be fair, Solomon was not the only author in the book of Proverbs. Solomon is credited with writing chapters 1 through 24. The 25th through 29th chapters were written 200 years later by the men of Judah who were serving King Hezekiah. Hezekiah was also a very wise man. Chapter 30 is credited to Agur, son of Jacob. And finally, chapter 31 was written by King Lemuel. If you're not sure who these last two men are, either am I. Neither are most Bible scholars. But they do credit them for being wise and contributing to the book of Proverbs. This gives us a little bit of background on the book of Proverbs. Now, we're going to start down our path. Our path is going to begin in Proverbs chapter 7. We know that when it comes to paths, the road you are on determines where you will end up. And that's going to become a key thing for us as we go through this study about paths. If we're headed south on I-55, right out our front doors, where are we going? We're going to Bloomington. We're going to ISU. Then we're going to go down through Springfield. We're going to wind up in St. Louis, because the direction that we travel determines our destination. If we go up here and get on I-80 West, we're going to Iowa. Whatever highway we are on is going to determine where we will end up. Therefore, I can say with confidence that your direction, not your intentions, determine your destination. When it comes to geography, that seems pretty simple. My direction, not my intention, determines my destination. That simple saying not only applies to driving, but it applies to all aspects of our life. It applies to our finances. It applies to our relationships in our family, with our spouse. It applies to our relationship with our God. It applies to our professional life. We can have the best of intentions, yet end up in the worst of situations. And that can happen to any of us. It does not matter how strong-willed you are, or how physically strong you are, how beautiful you are. The path that you take will determine where you end up. And we're going to illustrate this starting in Proverbs 7:6. And Solomon is telling us a story to illustrate a principle. And as I look at my audience, I'm a little bit relieved, because this is definitely a PG-13 story. Solomon says, "At the window of my house, I looked down through the lattice. I saw among the simple, I noticed among the young men, a youth who had no sense. He was going down the street near her corner, walking along in the direction of her house at twilight, as the day was fading, as the dark of night set in. Then out came a woman to meet him, dressed like a prostitute and with crafty intent. She is unruly and defiant. Her feet never stay at home. Now in the street, now in the squares, at every corner she lurks. She took hold of him and kissed him, and with a brazen face she said, 'Today I fulfilled my vows, and I have food from my fellowship offering at home. So I came out to meet you. I looked for you, and I have found you. I have covered my bed with colored linens from Egypt. I have perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Come, let's drink deeply of love till morning. Let's enjoy ourselves with love. My husband is not at home. He's gone on a long journey. He took his purse filled with money and will not be home till the full moon.' With persuasive words, she led him astray. She seduced him with her smooth talk. All at once he followed her, like an ox going to the slaughter, like a deer stepping into a noose till an arrow pierces his liver, like a bird darting into a snare, little knowing it will cost him his life." Now, it does not take a Bible scholar to understand what is going on here. Does everybody follow along with what is happening? Okay? And this particular young man was moving in a direction. So he was moving in a direction. Directions determine destination. He was going towards a particular woman's house. He knew who she was. He knew what she was. He knew she was married. And apparently, he knew her husband was out of town. The story that Solomon shares in his Book of Wisdom may seem a little bit racy for a Sunday morning. However, we're going to get a lesson out of this. He, the young man, knew that she would be out looking for something. More specifically, she would be out looking for someone. With our 2020 hindsight vision, we can say that should have stopped him dead in his tracks. But it didn't. It was specifically for this very reason that he was headed in that direction. That's the path he had chosen. We can conclude that this young man, he was excited. He was about to have an experience. While these thoughts of anticipation were running through the young man's head, Solomon was watching from his window. And Solomon had a completely different view, different thoughts about what was going to happen. Why? Because Solomon was older, Solomon was wiser. Solomon understood where this experience was going to lead. This night was a step down a path that this young man was traveling. And all paths lead somewhere. This particular path had a predictable destination. It's a bit ironic. What can seem so obvious to others, Solomon standing at the window. The church here today, reading the story in our pews. It seems an obvious thing that shouldn't be done. Yet, the person involved didn't see it that way. Because things like this often can escape our own perception. Solomon continues his observations of the woman. She was dressed like a prostitute. How does a prostitute dress? We can usually pick one out. I shouldn't do this, but I'm going to share a story. My wife and I were at a wedding in Milwaukee. And we had to walk from the hotel to the reception and then back to the hotel late at night after the reception. And as we're walking, I had her by the arm and I'm dragging her. And she's got heels and she's looking at me. And we were in a not so good area of town and there were two guys following us. But as we came up to the street corner, there were two women in that prostitute dress, which is, just above their butt, bent over talking in a car window. She didn't recognize what it was. But often we don't. But sometimes it seems pretty obvious. So Solomon tells us this woman was dressed like a prostitute. Her feet never stay at home. At every corner, she lurks. That's a very good description of this woman. She takes hold of him and kisses him brazenly. I looked up the definition of brazenly because I thought I knew what it meant, but I wanted to really understand. Brazenly means unrestrained by a sense of shame. Rudely bold or shameless. So she takes him and kisses him brazenly. She tells him that today I have fulfilled my vows. She has food left over from her fellowship offering. Remember here that we're talking about Old Testament times or under the old law. That fellowship offering was not an offering that was demanded or commanded. A fellowship offering was a voluntary offering. But a lot of people would assume they made this fellowship offering. She made herself right with God. She's all set till the next fellowship offering. So the same food that she had used in her fellowship offering, she was going to use with her new young lover. She tells him that she was out in the street just trying to find him. Just him. Not anybody else. It was just him she was looking for. Her words implied that she was all squared away with God. Almost as if saying, I've taken care of things with God, now we can do this. And she then begins to seduce him. She tells him, I have clean and luxurious sheets on my bed. I've taken a shower, perfumed myself, prepared for an evening of bliss. She invites him into her bed and suggests that they can be together until the morning. Oh, and just in case you're wondering, my husband, he's out of town. He's going to be gone for a long time. He took his purse full of money and he's not going to be back to the full moon. Again, the contrast with Solomon. Solomon sees how she's leading him astray, seducing him with her words. He tells, he followed her like an ox to the slaughter. And the casual observer on the street may not have observed this, may not have understood what was going on. Certainly the young man, he didn't see it from his perspective. He was too busy thinking about this experience that he was about to have. But Solomon knows that this young man may be throwing away his entire future, throwing away his entire life for one experience. As we continue in Proverbs, starting in verse 24, now then, my sons, listen to me. Pay attention to what I say. Do not let your heart turn to her ways or stray into her paths. Many are the victims that she has brought down. Her slain are a mighty throng. Her house is a highway to the grave, leading down to the chambers of death. So Solomon changes directions. He's telling us the story, but then he now says, listen, my sons. Who is he talking to? He's talking to all of us. He changes directions and he starts talking to all of us. And why he does that is he's trying to teach us a lesson. Do not let your heart turn to her ways or stray into her paths. There's our word, path. Remember, this young man was on a path. It wasn't a random event. He was heading in that direction, which will lead to a destination on purpose. And Solomon tells us that many are the victims that she has brought down. Not one, not a couple, not a few, many. Even though this young man believed that this was just a once-in-a-lifetime event for him, this same experience represents a well-worn path. A path that leads to death. The outcome is all too predictable. And Solomon tries to hammer home his wisdom here, and he tells us, her house is a highway to the grave, leading down to the chambers of death. A highway. Sure as this thing outside our front doors. 4 lanes wide, plenty of room, lots of people traveling. We've talked about the contrast and what the young man saw, what the young man was perceiving, and what Solomon saw. And unfortunately, there's a propensity for choosing the wrong path sometimes. A path that leads where we really don't want to go. I'm going to share a couple examples. A single woman says, I want to meet and one day marry a great Christian guy who's really got his act together. But then she dates the exact opposite, as long as he's cute. A single guy says, I want a great sex life once I'm married. So he practices with every girl he meets in the meantime. A married woman says, I want to have a great relationship with my husband. But she makes the children a priority over him. A husband said, I want my kids to respect me as they grow up. And then he openly flirts with every other woman in the neighborhood. A young Christian says, I want to develop a deep and lasting intimacy with God. So he gets up every morning and reads his newspaper. A working man says, I want to grow old and invest the latter years of my life with my grandchildren. But he neglects his health. A businessman says, I want to get thin and lose weight. Sure, go ahead, supersize that. A couple says, we'd like our children to develop a personal relationship with God and choose friends who have done the same. But then they skip church just about every weekend and head to the beach or sleep in and watch football on Sundays. Newlyweds determined to be financially secure by the time they reach their parents' age, but then they adopt a lifestyle sustained by debt and excess. A high school freshman intends to graduate with a GPA that will afford him any college he wants to go to, but he doesn't study. And the list could go on and on. There are so many examples. And these people all have legitimate goals. Their intentions are good. But like the young man in Solomon's story, the path they choose is going to lead them in a different direction, and they'll wind up at a destination that differs from the one they intended. If I want to lose 2 pant sizes, I can't eat breakfast and lunch at the donut shop. Just is not going to work. Now consider this. Sometimes it's easier to see this dangerous path or the wrong path in someone else's life. You may even be thinking of people who you wish were here today to hear this message. But before we try and help our friends or try and help our neighbors, we need to remember from Matthew 7:3, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? We need to ask ourselves a couple of questions. Are there disconnects in my own life? Are there discrepancies between what I desire in my heart and what I'm doing in my life? Are my intentions and my direction the same? If we're driving to a place where we've never been before, especially we're not using GPS, this is the old day when we got that map, we're trying to figure out where we're going. We get lost. But typically if we would backtrack far enough, we could figure out where we went wrong. Maybe we only wasted a few minutes, a few miles, maybe even a few hours. That's all. However, when we get lost in life, we lose much more than that. It's not a day, a month. It's an entire season of our life. It might be our entire life altogether. You don't want to wake up elderly and suddenly realize that you should have taken a different path. You only get one first chance once. You only have one senior year in high school. You only get to make one first impression. You get the idea. The path we choose at a critical junction does not just determine our destination for the following week, the following month, or even the following year. That choice follows us. It follows us for our entire life. The idea of the path working in our lives every minute of every day is what we need to be thinking about. We're all on a path. Financial, relational, ethical. And each one of these paths is going to lead us to a destination. Which reminds us, why would the young man in Solomon's story walk such a path? How come he doesn't see this coming? And you may already know the answer. Because he doesn't see what he's doing as walking a path. He sees it as a one-time experience or a one-time event. But the truth is that God teaches us that our life here on earth, we're walking a path. And that path is going to lead us to our final destination. It's not about the immediate. It's about the ultimate. You cannot change the principle behind the path, even with good intentions. And I'll say it again. It's your direction, not your intention, that will determine your destination. And maybe there have been times in your life when you just felt heartbroken. You asked, why would God let this particular thing happen to me, or to my spouse, or to my children? And the answer is, God wanted to stop it, but he could not stop you because you were on that path. God loves us and he gives us free will. He allows us to make our own choices. And sometimes the choices that we make put us on a path with a destination that we do not want. Before we finish up this morning, I want to ask you 2 questions. The first one is, what direction are you headed today? What direction are you going on your path? Morally, your family relationships, and your walk with God. And I want you to dwell on these. I want you to think about it. Discuss them with your friends and your spouse and your family. The second question I have for you, I may give you a little help with this. How do you choose the right path? First of all, we need to seek wisdom. That's what we're going to be talking about for the next few weeks as we work through some of these stories in the book of Proverbs. Interestingly, just a coincidence, we just started this study about the path. Today's August 2nd, yesterday was the 1st. There's 31 books, or 31 chapters in the book of Proverbs. Okay? If you would commit yourself to reading one chapter of the book of Proverbs a day, you'll be done at the end of the month. And we'll still be talking about the path. Because I have a lot of things that are going to tie into this study. But think about it. There's 31 chapters, okay? 31 days in August. Today you might have to read 2. I read part of the first chapter for you. So that's what I'm suggesting. Maybe just a chapter a day. And then you make your choices based on the long term. Try to see your life how God sees it. And you got to think about your life as a path. A series of steps, series of choices. And it's not just a bunch of unrelated experiences. It's a path. Make choices based on what will develop if you do something over a long period of time. Because that is the path that you're on. Every time you make that one-time decision, you're on that path. Now, the million-dollar question. What's with the fork? Okay? That would be awesome. We can't eat together, though. Not yet. Many times as we travel down that path, we come to a fork in the road. And we need to make a decision. Which fork am I going to follow? So, over the next few weeks as we're discussing this, my hope for you is this. That you use that fork to remind you of the path that you've chosen. Decorate it with some bling. Hopefully next week you're going to see some multicolored, glittery forks with sparkles on them. Put a string on it. Put it somewhere where you'll see it all the time. Hang it on your rearview mirror. Hang it on your refrigerator. Put it on your shower. Whatever you want to do with it, just as long as it reminds you. Because as we go down a path that we do something over and over, if I'm constantly reminded of the path, it might help us in our decision making. And if someone sees your fork, you are obligated to tell them what it's all about. It will open a door to explaining, why do you have a fork hanging from your rearview mirror? Let me tell you why it's there. And it should make you think. Every decision that I make is a new fork in the road. Every decision is taking us down a path. Ask God to help you choose the right path. Use wisdom to help yourself in making those decisions, the wisdom that we're going to gain from the book of Proverbs. And if you find yourself thinking that, you know what, might be even before you get to your car, I think I've been on the wrong path. Okay? It's not too late. There's breath in our lungs. So next week we're going to talk about changing paths. We're going to talk about what we do when we realize that we're not going where we want to go. That based on our direction, our destination isn't going to be what we thought it would be. As we conclude here today, the invitation is before you. Over the next few weeks, just to whet your appetite for this, I'm going to talk next week about making course corrections on your path. We'll talk about your heart matters when you're making these decisions. Getting help along the way on your path. Watch where you're going. And then at the end, we're going to talk about some unreachable destinations. If you need to study more, whether it be putting together a small group, we can do that online if we have to.